Wait, Leah, I think is still outside.
We are now officially launching this event. Excellencies, dear colleagues, good afternoon to who is with us at the Basel, Rotterdam and Stockholm Conventions meetings of the Conference of the Parties here in Geneva. And good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to who is with us online or is now watching the video of the event. We have the pleasure to welcome you today for a new session of the Geneva Plastic Solution Dialogues, the second today, which have kept the international community in Geneva and beyond engaged on this topic since the end of 2020, making links with the United Nations Environment Assembly and other international processes. This third series of the dialogues that kicked off in April is organized by the Geneva Environment Network in collaboration with the Basel, Rotterdam and Stockholm Conventions Secretariat, the Center for International Environmental Law, the Global Governance Center at the Graduate Institute, IUCN, Norway, Switzerland, and the Forum on Trade, Environment and SDGs, and the University of Geneva. The session today is co-organized with the International Pollutants Elimination Network, or IPEN, and with the support of the Nexus Free Foundation, CAP, and BAN. To introduce you to today's event, and to actually chair today's event and moderate the event, it's my pleasure to introduce IPEN Program and Policy Coordinator, Leah Esquillo. Leah, over to you.
Thank you, Diana. Good evening, everyone. We are so glad you could join us tonight. Allow me first to briefly introduce IPEN and our side event this evening. IPEN, or the International Pollutants Elimination Network, is comprised of over 600 public interest NGOs in more than 120 countries. We work to strengthen global and national chemicals and waste policies, contribute to groundbreaking research, and build a global movement for a toxics-free future. You've probably been hearing many of our interventions at the plenary. But this side event will focus primarily on the transboundary trade in refuse-derived fuel, Rdf. You'll be hearing a lot about that. And other similar fuels, like processed engineered fuels, which contain a high fraction of mixed plastic waste. You will hear about the Australian government's waste export ban being undermined by legislation allowing PEF exports to neighboring countries. The Australian case will illustrate the lack of controls around this hazardous trade. Further insights will be provided into the trends around Rdf imports, trade, and production affecting Indonesia and Malaysia, and concludes with the examination of recent plastic waste trade data relevant to the Asian region and the Basel Convention controls. So to cover all these, we will have 4 presentations to be followed by question and answer. So please hold on to your questions and we will tackle them all at the end. So our first speaker, Lee Bell, is IPEN's Mercury and POPs Policy Advisor based in Australia. Lee has over 25 years experience in POPs pollution research, contaminated sites policy, and technical analysis of industrial POP emission sources. Lee is a member of the Stockholm Convention's BAT expert group and recently co-authored Plastic Waste Management Hazards with Professor Shige Takada of the International Pellet Watch, which included a review of the plastic waste-based refuse-derived fuels. Lee will discuss waste export bans and the Rdf trade. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Leah. My name is Lee Bell, and I'm the Nutrient Policy Advisor for IPEN. I'll be talking today about the Australian waste export ban and how that's being undermined by exporting waste plastic as fuel into the region. The Australian context around plastic waste export. I'll just give a little bit of history as to what's been occurring in the last few years. So in 2017, many of you will be familiar with China's National Sword policy, which was implemented to reduce environmental damage from imported waste into China. Waste exporters like Australia rely heavily on China to take the waste and now redirects those waste exports to other countries in Southeast Asia. Post-2017, Australia's low-grade plastic waste exports to Asia that were destined for recycling often ended up dumped, open burned, or used as fuels with minimal recycling. Helps food chain contamination from burning plastic was identified as a result. Import countries began to reject and return Australian shipments of low-grade and contaminated plastic waste. 2019, the Basel Ban Amendment enters into force, preventing OECD countries exporting hazardous waste, including many types of plastic waste, to all non-OECD countries. In 2021 and 2020, in response to neighbouring country waste rejections and tighter export controls, Australia begins to invest in a domestic recycling program and announces a waste export ban, one of the first in the world that we're aware of. Right now, refuse-derived fuel exports with higher plastic waste content, usually in excess of 30%, but often much higher, for burning in cement kilns as fuel, emerge as part of Australia's recycling plan, undermining their waste export ban and potentially breaching the Basel Ban Amendment. Other countries in the region increasingly import, trade and produce these Rdf variants to burn in local cement kilns or in other countries' cement kilns. Environmental contamination and carbon emissions from burning plastic waste as fuel has become a growing regional threat. So what is China's National Sword policy? It's a policy in which the country's latest and strictest regulation on imports of solid waste as raw materials is applied. The policy bans various plastic, paper and solid waste, including plastics such as PET, PE, PVC and PS. And there are many others. It's essentially banning mixed and contaminated plastic wastes in favour of clean and processed plastic waste. The National Sword policy prompted waste exporting countries like Australia to review their domestic recycling infrastructure and other export options. With minimal mixed plastic waste recycling options available in Australia, other export destinations were targeted. We have been relying for decades on waste exports to countries with low labour costs and environmental standards for recycling, which meant many export countries like Australia, who base their recycling on export, had minimal domestic waste recycling infrastructure in place, especially for plastic waste. The 2019 Basel Ban Amendment enters into force. Plastic waste export controls tighten even further. So if people are interested in an analysis of the ban amendment, IPEN has provided a guide to the implications and the next steps involved, and that's available on the IPEN website. As I mentioned, for decades, Australia had followed an export model of waste recycling. Australians would place their recycling material in their recycling bins, believing it was heading to processing facilities within Australia and being turned into new plastic waste goods. The reality was much darker. The plastic waste that was collected for recycling had been exported to China, Malaysia, Thailand, and other Asian countries, including Indonesia. Similar waste from Europe and the US also followed this route, and from many other countries. Much of this waste is not recycled and was eventually open burned or used as crude industrial fuel, including in the tow tofu factory boilers in Tripodi. IPEN monitoring found extremely high levels of dioxins and other toxic chemicals in soil and chicken eggs in Tripodi and other towns where plastic waste was burned and toxic emissions resulted. You can see those smokestacks. That's moved on. I'm sorry. You can see those smokestacks burning waste. Seems to be advancing on its own. And black smoke resulting from those. So the results of this black smoke and fallout from burning plastic was wide food chain contamination. And there's a report there, Plastic Waste Poisons Indonesia's Food Chain, which IPEN has produced, which contains that data for those who are interested. So under pressure from these surging contaminated plastic imports, Indonesia, Malaysia and the Philippines started rejecting those Australian waste shipments. A story by the New York Times covered the Indonesian plastic burning issues. Thank you. Some mistiming on this. And it became a hot political issue in Australia as to what to do about our waste exports. In response to the political pressure that grew, the Australian government at that time, we have a new Australian government now, they reacted and was applauded for announcing a waste export ban and announcing massive domestic recycling investment. There was a $1 billion waste and recycling plan announced to transform the waste industry and ban on waste plastic exports and other types of waste as well. The recycling focus included investment in refuse-derived fuel and process-engineered fuel. Refuse-derived fuel and process-engineered fuel are basically shredded plastics, paper, timber, fabric and other combustible waste compressed into solid fuel pellets or bales for burning in cement kilns and incinerators in Asia. These may be exported from Australia as product, i.e. fuel, and not waste, even though they are made of waste. In this form, they may avoid the restrictions of the Basel Convention, International Trade in Waste, where they should be classified at least as Y48 due to its high plastic content. However, the Basel Plastic Waste Guidance fails to address the implications of this waste trade. And we're currently dealing with the Plastic Waste Technical Guidelines here, and there is very little information available to anyone in that guidance about this particular trade, or even the contents of this RDF material. Australia produces more than 250,000 tonnes annually for use in Australia, and also has plans to significantly expand production and exports into Southeast Asia. Very soon after these announcements were made, it was quite obvious, very soon after these announcements were made, it was quite obvious that there were problems associated with the trade, and Reuters conducted an exclusive investigation, and Australia came under fire for shipping their plastic waste as fuel to these countries. Australian waste companies, Resource Code and Cleanaway have significant plans for RDF and process-engineered fuel expansion in the region, which includes establishing factories in other countries to produce the waste in those countries for distribution and in some ways to overcome some of the export issues. So RDF and even solid recovered fuel, which is often made of tyres, and their transboundary movements in Asia mapped out here in this International Energy Association report. China and India are currently major final customers, but Australian countries intend to export more of these materials to countries in the region, and they're certainly targeting the Philippines. A short summary of plastic waste trade from Australia in the year 2021, following both Basel ban amendments and the announcement of a plastic waste ban, waste export ban, shows that the reality is quite different from what they're claiming the ban would produce. And so Australia is actually a country that increased its plastic waste exports in 2021 up from 2020. The main destinations remain places like India, Vietnam and Malaysia, and this is in the context of the government making their national ban active in 2021. Another concerning development is this sort of unilateral determination by Australia to consider RDF and PEF as a non-waste that is not subject to these kind of waste export bans or controls. However, the federal regulators have informed licensed applicants who wish to export the material they may have to apply for a hazardous waste export license. which seems contradictory. So Rdf and PEF export volumes are also very, very difficult to track, as they don't have a specific HS code and fall under much broader plastic waste HS codes, which tend to obscure the actual volumes that are involved. So our view is that with Australian exports of plastic waste to burn in neighbouring countries, this issue must come to an end, and we recommend that the exports should be classified as waste shipments and not product exports, to clarify the status of these materials and to subject them to the Basel transboundary controls. Rdf and PEF and associated waste used as fuel should be assigned a very specific HS code, so there's trade transparency and the ability to track. Rdf and PEF should be rapidly phased out as an environmentally unsound management practice for plastic waste due to toxic emissions when burned, food chain contamination and a high carbon footprint, because we can't always ensure that they are actually burned and consumed in facilities that meet the highest regulatory standards. There is a newly elected Australian government, literally a week or two ago, who can now review this practice, and we'll be talking to them and this use and the export with a view to implementing a real waste export ban. And if you'd like to know more about this particular issue, there's a couple of publications that IPEN has available, and they're available on the IPEN website, and there's a few copies by the door as well. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Lee, for your enlightening presentation. So from your presentation, it's clear now that even if Australia has supposedly a waste export ban, Australia actually still exports its waste to neighboring countries in the guise of plastic fuel. So let us now move on to the next presentation. We will look at the Rdf situation in Indonesia. Joining us remotely is our next speaker, Yuyun Ismawangi. Yuyun is the co-founder of Nexus 3 Foundation, an Indonesian NGO which works to safeguard the public, especially vulnerable populations, from the impact of development on their health and the environment. Yuyun is an environmental engineer and holds a Master of Science in Environmental Change and Management from the University of Oxford. She won the Goldman Environment Prize in 2009. Over to you, Yuyun.
Thank you so much, Leah. Good afternoon, everyone. Good evening. Thank you for having me in this session. And as Lee already provided the intro, I'd like to share the component of this study in Indonesia. So I will need help to move my slide. Thank you. Next, please. Yeah, this is just a quick introduction. We can skip this part, but you can see that we belong to various networks. Next, please. So to start with, I just want to share this waste composition of Indonesia. So the data in 2020 shows that the composition of the Indonesian waste are mainly coming from households and traditional market, which dominated by organic waste. And on the right side is composition based on the type of waste. And food waste and also wood, branches and leaves are also a big part of the Indonesian waste. And we can see that plastics about 17%, and then cardboards and others are the rest. Next, please. So within the Indonesian government, there are policies and regulations related to Rdf and waste management. I'm sorry, it's a bit complicated, but you can see the structure from the national law and then government regulations and then ministerial regulations until at the bottom is the local government regulations. At the local level, the government regulations, sub-regional regulations already ban several plastic packagings. And at the national level, also there are regulations to and strategies to reduce plastic waste and manage it. And also recently, the government announced the requirement for FMCGs and retailers to submit their roadmap to reduce plastic waste about 30% by 2030. However, this strategy also linked to the energy strategy, which by 2025, the government is planning to have mixed energy sources. And as you can see, the compositions on the right side, it's shifted a little bit, not heavily relying on oil and coal, and they would like to increase more from the renewable energy and new energy sources. Which, if we see further, the compositions of renewable energy also consisted of biomass. And biomass here can be in form of pellets and briquettes from biomass. And interestingly, plastic is considered as a new sources of energy and mixed waste because we have problem with waste management system. Next, please. And looking specifically into the plastic materials and plastic industry in Indonesia, about 50% of the virgin materials to make plastics in Indonesia are actually imported. Although Indonesia also produces a lot of virgin materials, but well, it's still considered low capacity. And to produce plastics, producers also imported plastic waste to mix it with virgin materials. However, when they arrived in Indonesia, the waste inside the containers are mixed like this, including in the paper bales. So you can see one of the containers was coming from a paper company, and inside that paper bales are a lot of plastic packaging, especially flexible packaging. Next, please. So Indonesia also followed these references about the type or grade of Rdf, which is mainly Rdf type 5 that used widely for especially coal-fired power plants and cement kiln. And based on this reference, a lot of projects are now pushed into towards this direction of creating or producing Rdf pellets and briquettes. Next, please. So, as I mentioned earlier, that the type of waste in Indonesia are mainly organic, and this is the table presented here from the Ministry of Energy and Mineral Resources when they try to identify the new sources of renewable energy from biomass. And we can see this, the potential from every island that the municipal waste also identified at the bottom. But actually, if they are looking for the biomass sources, it will be more from agriculture, will be better than the municipal waste. Next, please. So, to support the Indonesian government strategy to on waste management by 2030, by 2025 and until 2030, the government also set the target to have Rdf plants about 40 until 2030, and then waste to energy plants about 23 plants. And to support this, there are several national standards that have been issued, especially standards related to Rdf biopellets and then briquettes. And these, we call it SNI. So these SNI are mainly voluntary. So actually it doesn't matter whether the producer will follow any of this SNI or not, because it's a voluntary standard. Next, please. And more than 20 coal-fired power plants are now scheduled to have Rdf as a coal-firing mechanism or alternative fuels. And and many of them used various things of biomass, and some of them used Rdf as the co-firing, especially for coal-fired power plants that belong to or runs by the PLNs, or the Indonesian power. The problem with this is that if we're talking about climate, so replacing coal with another fossil fuel, I don't think it's compatible, because it's still the same thing, issue the emission of CO2 emissions. Moreover, the emissions will be more toxic because they will have a mix of plastics in the Rdf. Next, please. For cement kiln, we call it, they call it co-processing, not co-firing, because all of this mixed waste will be burned together with the limes and other materials to produce cement. And as we know that the dioxins monitoring are very challenging in developing countries, including in Indonesia. However, this is also included in the target of the thermal substitution rate, 15% until 23% by 2025. So many state-owned companies are now being pushed to have this thermal substitution rate, meaning that they can replace, or they should replace, coal with other materials or Rdf from biomass or from anything else. To achieve this, however, the cement companies and also the coal-fired power plants have to increase their capital investment to accommodate different kind of materials being burned. And they have to collaborate with the suppliers to fulfill the capacity to replace 5%, 1 until 5% of coal. Next, please. To support this, the government also has the Ministry of Environment regulations on the emission standards. And due to lack of the capacity of local laboratory to analyze dioxins, the government then set the standard to analyze, to monitor PCDs, dioxins and furans, only every 4 years. And this is for cement industry that use and produce cement every day and use the fuel also every day. But for cement kiln that co-firing hazardous waste, they have to be measured at least once a year, depending on the permit that they obtained. And furthermore, we have heavy metals issues released from the cement kiln emissions. So there are several monitoring standards that need to be tightened. Next, please. So at the local level, we also have Rdf now, a lot of them now, actually small scale, to process mixed waste and waste residues from communities and residential areas. And some of them are supported by FMCGs like Unilever or Danone. And in this slide, I just presented the case that we have in Bali, where household waste being processed and processed to become Rdf, like the picture in the middle. And this Rdf production is really acidic, because I went there and then I could feel the smoke, acidic, that I inhaled, and the community surrounding that area, the facility of MRF, also complaining many times. And interestingly, Danone has just submitted to FERA to have plastic credit for the amount of waste that they processed in this facility. We have tried to communicate with Vera about the standard for certifications of plastic credit, because if it's going to be burned or especially in boilers or small scale facilities for laundry or even for barbecue, it's scary because there is no emission control in that small units. With this evidence and complaints from the communities, we try to communicate with Vera, which is the company who provide the certifications, and also with Danone. It's an ongoing process now, but since this project launched last year, this became the model now, which is scary for us because it's uncontrolled, but it's widely supported. So next, please. So as we try to understand how we should improve and the government should improve the waste management system, we have this issue of plastic waste importation by plastic companies, but also by paper companies. And we've seen this, the number of plastic waste imported by Indonesia decreased by 2021, but this is not the final number yet, because I believe the report has not been 100% complete. But we can see that the number of plastic waste importation declining, although the type of plastics also we can see on the right side is changing. Next, please. And we tried to see the entry points for PEF to Indonesia using several HS code. In this case, using 3825, which is municipal waste, where we could see also in many other countries being used to send the plastic waste or the Rdf. Well, in other countries also different codes has been used, like 400, 400 or 700, 700, you know. So there are different HS code being used to transfer or to trade Rdf. And in this case, in 2020, it was the highest one was from Australia. Next, please. Yeah, so this is 369. That's also used as the entry point of PEF. Yeah, so we can see this data, but it's difficult because they are all scattered. Next, please. So we hope that with the Indonesian government strategy to support Rdf and with all the subsidies and so on, we hope that the Indonesian government could allocate the fund more to improve waste management system as a whole, and also using zero waste approaches. And then we would like to see more clarity in the prohibitions of importations of waste for alternative fuel under the code HS code 3825 or 690, and implement the Basel Amendment effectively and strengthen the border. Because at the moment we haven't seen any translations of the Basel Amendment in Indonesia. And then emission standards have to be strengthened and strengthened. And no Rdf productions and use for small scale or residential areas should be allowed. Increase the capacity of laboratory, especially to analyze POPs, and then publish the roadmap of circular economy for paper and plastic industry, so we will know what's going on. And then the voluntary SNI is useless unless they are mandatory, and we would like to see no subsidy given to Rdf plant or waste to energy plant. Thank you for the opportunity, so looking forward to have the discussion.
Thank you again also very much, Yun, for making time for us, and we hope that your connection remains strong so you could be with us until the Q&A. Next up is Mageswari to share with us this time the situation of Rdf in Malaysia, one of the destinations of the Australian waste. Mages is a senior research officer in the Community and Environment section of Consumers Association of Penang, and is also an honorary secretary with Sahabat Alam Malaysia, or that's Friends of the Earth Malaysia. In the past few years, Margeswari has been working on the issue of plastics pollution, toxics, and waste trade for both organizations. Marges, you have the floor.
Good evening, everyone. So I work with the Consumers Association of Penang. We are based in an island, and this organization was established in 1969. What we do is we work on consumer rights and also on environmental issues. So in terms of this work that we have done with IPEN, we actually studied on what is happening in terms of processed engineered fuel coming into Malaysia. Okay, so through our studies, we found that there was already an Rdf plant which was developed in 2006. Prior to that, the scientists and also the engineer was saying this is the one-off plant. It can solve our municipal solid waste problem. Yeah, it can divert the waste from going to landfill. So real big hoo-ha about it, and then convinced the government. Yeah, and finally they were given the right to develop the plant. So it was developed in 2006 with a capacity of 1,000 tons per day and 8.9 megawatts electricity. So this is a pilot project. But just a year later, we were getting complaints from people in the surrounding areas saying that there's complaints of odor, waste that was supposed to go in. So it was sent to the plant, but then it was sent out again because they could not fully operate. So when they were questioning, said, it's like running at 70% capacity. Yeah, and finally it actually just failed. It was a failed project. There were a lot of problems, and when we were studying what's happened to it, we found that it was finally shut down in 2015. The company had also gone bankrupt. So this was a real failure in terms of an Rdf plant in Malaysia. Next, what we did was we were studying, we were investigating what's happening. Of course, Malaysia was the top waste dump site, we can say. That was in 2018, and we got waste from all over the world after China closed its doors to waste imports. So we had a lot of reporters coming in, and there's reporters on 60 Minutes Australia and also other media came, and they opened the containers of plastic waste, supposed to be clean plastic waste. When they opened, it was like stench, yeah, because it was contaminated with you may have your Tetra Paks or this multi-layered packaging, but there was still milk in those packaging. So it was really bad. So this was one instance, yeah. And Malaysia, as Lee had already mentioned, they repatriated the waste back to Australia. Okay, so we were still studying on what's happening, and as Yuan had also pointed out, it was kind of difficult for us to find out what exactly was coming into Malaysia. So HS, because there are so many codes, yeah. So HS 3915 is for the plastic waste that was coming in, and then for Rdf it was 3825, and 3825 is municipal waste, yeah. For Rdf itself, it's 3825.10. But waste was also coming in as processed engineered fuel. That was so we were looking at the Singapore customs, and that's what Malaysia also had followed, 3606.90.10. And when we were looking at the data, so you can see it's not that clear. Indonesia was also exporting waste to Malaysia, and Yuan and I were investigating. So what was Indonesia exporting to Malaysia? It was they were exporting spent bleaching earth. So this is a byproduct from oil palm processing. So Malaysia and Indonesia are large oil palm. They have large oil palm plantations and processing industry, and so these were also dumped indiscriminately. Yeah, the importers had dumped it because they were not able to process it. It was supposed to be processed to biofuel or biodiesel. Yeah? And you can see that the one in blue was Australian waste, which was imported to Malaysia, but it had reduced. Why was it reduced? This is a clearer copy. 3915 plastic waste was coming in, and it is in 2018 it was 44 million kilogram. It reduced in 2019 because Malaysia had stricter controls on the imports, but then it's slowly increasing, as Lee had also pointed out. Yeah. If you look at HS 360690 for process engineered fuel, 2014, 2015, it was coming into Malaysia, but it stopped in 2016. Why did it stop? Because we managed to stop it. Yeah? We had intelligence from the company that was importing waste that this company was using a different word. It was actually waste that was coming in, yeah? But they said this is solid fuel. And so in the customs code, it was solid fuel that was coming in. And we lodged an official complaint to the Malaysian government. So the customs department said, yeah, this is not fuel, this is waste. Because the type of thing was coming in was shredded plastic waste. Yeah? And also, fortunately, when the Department of Environment went and did an inspection in the factory, they found electronic waste. So electronic waste is hazardous waste. So, the government had some reasons to repatriate the waste back to Australia. So we were successful, and the government also decided that there should not be any more imports of this kind of feedstocks, which was being sent as fuel. So we also had a demonstration in front of the factory. It's called Refuse-Derived Asia, which we had also had mentioned. Refuse-Derived is an Australian company which has plants in Malaysia and also had started plants in Indonesia. Okay, so we were successful in doing that. And so next question is Australia banning waste exports. We had also mentioned, and we were really looking into what's happening. And you can look at the plastic rules. Yeah, you can see. So you can no longer able to export mixed waste plastics, but you can export materials which are processed as process engineered fuel. So it is still plastic because PEF is like at least 30 to 40 to 50% contains plastic waste. So this is still coming in. So this is how it looks like. Yeah? The process engineered fuel looks like this. Yeah. So it's coming in another way, and then it's not only plastic waste. Okay, tires are also coming. Tires, yeah. So it's mentioned tires that can be exported from Australia. So if it's processed into crumbs or shreds, then it can be considered as tire-derived fuel, and it was still coming into our countries, yeah, to Indonesia. I'm not sure whether it was also being imported by Philippines. Yeah, and what happened was we thought that there was like no more waste which was coming in as fuels, but there was this stockyard which was burning in flames, and what after investigation by the Malaysian government, we found that it was waste tire which was exported from Australia, and it was meant to go into cement kilns in Malaysia. Yeah, so it went different. So this is like where waste tire which is exported to from Australia goes to Japan, Korea, Philippines. Yeah, so that is what's happening. Okay, so what is Malaysia's policy? So the Resource-Co, because they are not able to import any more waste, what they did was they are now locally sourcing waste. Yeah, and you can see there's a picture there. This is a picture of a waste dump. This was plastic waste which was imported in 2018 and was just dumped. Yeah, on the dump site, because not all plastic can be recycled. Yeah, so whatever residual waste was dumped here, and this company, Resourceco, convinced the Malaysian government, we will clean up the waste for you, because they needed waste. They didn't have enough waste. Their capacity is 100,000 tons of waste to be processed in a year. So they didn't have enough waste. Now they are sourcing for waste, so they offered to clean up the waste for the government. So the government was thinking, okay, all right, fine. Yeah, we're doing it for free, because if not, who's going to pay for it? It's not the exporters who are paying to clean up. So this seemed to be a good idea for the government, and we agreed. Next slide. Okay. So these are the types of waste that is being processed to fuel. We visited the company. You can see the picture of this black shiny thing. These are actually electronic waste. Also has plastic components. These are shredded. Yeah, and then these are all mixed. You can see the excavator there, which is mixing it. And they have also started using textile waste. Yeah, yesterday we were listening to what's going to happen to textile. So this is what's happening in Malaysia. Textile waste is also being mixed into the process engineered fuel, the fuel mix, and this is being burnt in cement plants. So this is the cement plant. We have 9 plants in next slide, please. 9 cement plants, which is co-processing process engineered fuel, or tire-derived fuel, or refuse-derived fuel, and also scheduled waste. And this scheduled waste is sourced locally. And next slide, please. Malaysia also has the guidelines on co-processing in terms of emissions monitoring. You know, this cement plants also have hazardous toxic gas emissions, but all these heavy metals, HCl, dioxins and furans, they only have to monitor those emissions minimum once per year. So under our clean air regulations, only twice a year. So what's happening all the other days of the year? Yeah, we wouldn't know. Yeah? So if they are going to test on that particular day, they will have the proper mix of waste to be tested, and also in terms of the emissions. So we do also have continuous emission monitoring systems. Okay, so what's missing if all this doesn't work? Yeah, our demands to prevent dumping, we need to end waste colonization, stop waste trade, ban trade of waste-based fuels, these are the feedstocks, ensure full traceability and transparency of waste treatments. For now, we are not really able to check what exactly is coming in, because they use the different HS codes, and there's also fraudulent reporting, the declaration in terms of the bills of lading. So we really need transparency. And also in terms of monitoring and enforcement measures that has to be taken to stop this illegal waste trade. Because our customs department, they are not able to check all the containers that are coming in. Yeah? It's really impossible. So they will have to be ticked off in terms of what is coming in. Yeah, then only they can open up. Yeah? We do have scanners, but the scanners also break down. Yeah? So this is really impossible. So to solve all this problem, what we're saying is just stop waste trade. All the countries should take care of their own waste. Yeah? And not only in terms of the waste, we need to also prioritize reduction, and don't go for these false solutions, cement plants, or we're using coal-fired power plants, saying that, okay, we are going to reduce using fossil fuels, yeah, for our climate action. So these are all the false solutions. And we have also recently submitted a memorandum to the Malaysian government to stop co-opting blocking plastic waste imports which are repackaged as feedstock. So we are awaiting response from them. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Agnes, for your valuable and very disturbing inputs. Our final speaker is Jim Paquet. He is the Executive Director of the Basel Action Network, based in Seattle, Washington. Jim has been personally involved in the Basel Convention since its adoption in 1989. And since that time, BAN has been at the forefront of investigations, reporting, and actions to end the exploitative trade in e-waste, obsolete ships, and plastic waste. For his presentation, Jim will help us understand Rdf within the purview of the Basel Convention and how we could possibly get out of this hazardous trade. Over to you, Jim.
Thank you, Leah. Yeah, so when you've seen and heard what you just heard, you would like to think there ought to be a law, right? And that law is having its meeting right now, the Basel Convention. And we are going to explore now, what the relationship is with Rdf and the Basel Convention. The reason we need to explore is if you look at the convention, you will not find the words refuse-derived fuel anywhere, not in any of its annexes. And it's such a prominent waste, and it's an emerging waste stream that we're going to have to do something about that. But with the convention we've got, let's think about where it really sits. So the burning question is, does Rdf escape Basel Convention controls, or can we say it's controlled? And so we'll look at what is meant by control in the Basel Convention. Basel Convention doesn't control all trade. It doesn't even control all waste trade. So what it does control is hazardous wastes, which are listed in Annex 8, Annex 1, and Annex 3. I think I got it.
Oh, yeah.
This is what, so then 7, that's a different annex. Or they can be other wastes on Annex 2. Now, there are differences. The primary default control mechanism is prior informed consent. Hazardous waste, however, is impacted by the Basel ban amendment. Other waste is not. So it'll be impacted by a ban when it's going from OECD to non-OECD, for example. So there are two ways to fall outside of controls then. You can declare your material as a non-waste. You can say, this is not really waste, this is a product, it's a commodity, so therefore you're outside of the scope of the convention. The other thing you can do is you can say it's a waste, but it's neither a hazardous waste nor an Annex 2 waste or other waste. So the big questions here that we have to look at with respect to this particular waste stream are, is Rdf a waste? And if so, is it a hazardous waste? And if not, is it on Annex 2 as another waste? Those things aren't answered somewhere in the affirmative, we're in trouble. So the first question is it a waste? Waste is defined as substances or objects that are disposed of or required to be disposed of. Disposal is important, as you can see in this definition. It's linked to the definition of waste very directly. So disposal is defined as materials or objects going to any of the operations on Annex 4. And there's recycling operations, there's final disposal operations, but that is the way we define the scope of the Basel Convention with Annex 4. So we got to turn to Annex 4. And when we go to the very beginning of the second part of Annex 4, we see, aha, R1, used as a fuel. So on the face of it, this would appear to clearly be a waste. And in fact, in the EU, they have put it in their waste catalog as 1912-10 combustible waste refuse-derived fuel. So they actually use the term. So the EU is no problem calling it a waste. So I think we're safe in saying it's a waste, but there are countries that are starting to adopt this criteria called when waste ceases to be a waste. And the EU has done this, and it's very concerning because it is a way on a national level a country can say, okay, it might be listed in Basel, but we think it's reached a position or has been processed to a point where we're not gonna call it a waste anymore. And they can probably do that at the national level. Basel doesn't have this kind of criteria. That's why it has to be done at a national level. Countries can decide that waste, once they are processed and made into RDF, cease to be a waste. And I'm not quite sure if Australia has been so bold to say that's what they're doing. It seems like their policy is a bit of a muddle at the moment, but this is the danger. This is what they would do. They would say that the processing that we're doing makes it no longer a waste. So, let's look at hazardous waste, because waste is not enough, remember. It's gotta be either hazardous or on Annex 2. And hazardous waste, you can look at Annex 8, and that is a list of waste presumed to be hazardous that are based on the real fundamental test of Article 11A. And that 11A is, does the material contain an Annex 1 hazardous constituent and at the same time possess an Annex 3 hazardous characteristic? Well, I looked at Annex 8 and I can assure you, like I told you, it's not there. RDF is not listed on Annex 8, so we have to revert to this definition, Article 11A. So we look at this a little closer. Looking, RDF, like I said, is not found on Annex 8, but does it have a hazardous constituent with an Annex 3 hazardous characteristic? Well, how the heck can you know? This is the unique thing about waste collected from municipalities or commercial waste. We don't know what they threw in that dumpster. We don't know if there's a load of pesticides in there, heavy metals, electronic waste. At any given point in time, RDF could be very hazardous. You just don't know. So if the RDF had heavy metals, pesticides, then yeah, but who's going to know? So this waste is derived, local pickups. We really don't know what people throw in their garbage at any given time. So to really have true knowledge, you would have to have constant testing of every batch. That isn't happening, folks. So no certainty then for RDF without extensive and constant testing. So when the convention was formed, that was one of the reasons why Annex 2 was created. The household waste and residues from household waste, nobody knew that whether they're hazardous or not. So they said, we still have to control this because they could be at any given time. So they created this Annex 2, which will give controls, but not the full control of hazardous waste. So when we go into Annex 2, which now has new importance, because this is looking like more and more where things will end up for RDF, we can very plainly see we have waste collected from households. But some might argue it's not always collected from households. We can make our RDF from production waste, from commercial sources, and then we can step aside from that Y46 definition. Not making me feel good. Some might argue that RDF has been manipulated and proportions of waste change, so it's no longer waste collected from households, even if it was originally. That's pretty scary. So other waste, let's keep going. If it's not Y46, then it could be the new Annex 2 listing for plastics, Y48, which is mixed and contaminated plastics. That makes me feel a little bit better because as Naga said, this stuff has 50 to 60% plastics in it usually. That's where the calorific value comes from. That's why they can burn this stuff. It is a form of fossil fuel. But some might really argue that RDF is really not a plastic waste. It doesn't look like a plastic waste. It's something very different. So a national government could interpret it that it's not a Y48 waste. So the cold hard facts, after all those burning questions have been lighting us up here, is that is it a Basel waste? RDF is fairly clearly a waste at global level, but countries at a national level could twist that and say it's no longer. So again, they might say it's been processed and thus ceases to be a waste, is now a product. And unless you can prove it, it's likely not to be considered a hazardous waste. Unless you can actually go, aha, we've seen that every one of these has heavy metals, pesticides, what have you in it. And it may very well fall through the cracks of Annex 2, therefore. There's no slam dunk that RDF is on Annex 2. So the current ambiguity is ripe for exploitation. And we're gonna have to do something about that ambiguity. So my recommendations, what the heck, is that RDF should be nominated by a party for entry into Annex 8, or at the very least Annex 2. And then once we do that, we can write a guidance document warning people about all the problems. When you're burning this plastic, you're creating serious problems. There could be PVC in there, there's brominated flame retardants. This is all gonna turn into dioxins, and at the local level in neighborhoods in Indonesia, Malaysia, where have you. So people need to be alerted, and it should be a guidance document to that effect. People should cease the caveman mentality, as I call it, of burning waste. Even if they're not hazardous, even if it's the old, right now we're living in a climate crisis. You don't want to put carbon in the atmosphere. We've got to stop the idea of burning waste. Full stop. I don't care what you're talking about, whether it's rice hulls or whatever. You don't want to be burning stuff anymore. Countries and local governments should begin to pass measures to forbid the production of RDF and other waste burning methods and operations and products. It's not environmentally sound management. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jim, for your very informative presentation. We will now open the floor for open forum. So if you have questions, just please speak up loud so we can hear you, and state your name, country perhaps. And if you have a particular speaker you want to direct your question to, please also mention your name. Before we go to the questions, let me also introduce to you first. So the cases you heard tonight, so Australia, Indonesia, Malaysia, and actually also the Philippine experience, my home country, is subject of a research that IPEN published just early this year, last March. So we have a copy of the executive summary of the research. We have copies there at the back. Please feel free to get one, and the full research is available in our website. So, do we have some questions for our speakers? Those online watching us can also ask their questions. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I am Dr. Zainabad from Pakistan. As you mentioned that there is no specific guideline on RDF and specified HS code for the transportation from one country to another. So, as you mentioned in many examples from Malaysia and Indonesia, that plastic waste in the form of RDF is coming. So, is there any regulatory measures being adopted in Malaysia and Indonesia, that how you can control these type of waste which have no HS code, and under that RDF more than 30% plastic waste, which is already controlled under the category of Basel Convention. So this is my point, that how can we take the national measure to control this RDF from development in, like you mentioned, Australia to the development. Thank you.
Who wants to answer?
Of course, we want to see it happen in Basel, because I think that would give cover to a lot of national governments to say, oh, Basel, we're a party, we're obligated. And so it will shut down a lot of arguments and fighting in the capitals of your country, that Basel will take a stand on this. But we do have the ban amendment. And I think you need very strongly, this is an initial strategy, so say this is absolutely either Y48 or Y46. And while we have the ban amendment doesn't apply to Annex 2, we're going to make it apply to Annex 2. So this is actually what the European Union has done, as well as Switzerland and Liechtenstein. When they enacted or implemented the Basel ban amendment, they said we're going to include Annex 2 as well. And that is a strategy for you to make this clearly part of the ban amendment. And of course, you got to ratify the ban amendment. Anybody else have anything on that?
I would just like to make the point that there is also the process of testing. Customs importers can do some analysis of the material that's coming in, and as we know, households use a lot of different products, and if you're importing something like processed engineered fuel, it may have some sort of separation of some of the hazardous materials out of it. But it's still very difficult to remove things like PVCs and broken computer plastics that might contain brominated flame retardants and so on. So you can make a determination at national level after some sampling as to whether you consider it to have the characteristics that constitute hazardous waste, and you can prohibit the further imports from those exporting countries on that basis. You know, all countries can control their own borders for these types of waste, and you can unilaterally declare it a hazardous material subject to some testing. And you can also go the other pathway, which is to require laboratory certificates from the exporters demonstrating that there is no hazardous material before it ever leaves the country of export towards your country. And place the onus on the exporting country to spend the money to do the analysis and to demonstrate that on a shipment by shipment basis there is no hazardous material.
Thank you, sir.
Yes, just a follow-up to your explanation. How do you know that the exporter is telling you the truth? Because maybe as a developing country, because, okay, let me start by introducing myself. My name is Charles Ipia from Nigeria. I work with the Federal Ministry of Environment. And we have problems, you know, with this Rdf. We are being inundated by requests, you know, for us to allow imports, you know, of Rdf into the country. And we have this dilemma of knowing what the composition is. One, we don't allow plastic waste into the country. Then, with under the guise of Rdf, you know, pressure is being mounted on us. You know, this is no longer waste. It's for fuel energy purposes. So, and we don't have the capacity to test, to analyze these products. We request for material data safety sheet. Of course, it is provided. We were not comfortable because it's possible that we are not being told to take fruit. And so, what we do?
I completely agree with your position, which is that I'm very cynical about waste exporters conducting their own testing and telling you what might be in the material. Independent audits could be provided by third parties, national auditing agencies of some sort that can do the analysis in the country of export. But I certainly wouldn't rely on the exporter to provide the information themselves. It's not in their interest to do so if they've got hazardous material in there. And so if it comes down to those sorts of questions, it would be entailing the precautionary principle would be to prohibit the material from entering the country under any circumstances. And the best way to do that would have clear, definitive statements through the Basel Convention about what this material actually is, what it constitutes, and what the potential is for it to be hazardous. And Jim mentioned a number of the clauses that could be used to make a very clear statement about the nature of this material. And at the moment, it's left completely opaque. It's very, very difficult to actually define refuse-derived fuel or process-engineered fuel through the convention. And there's new names being developed for these materials on what seems like a weekly basis. So all sorts of companies will develop their own names around certain types of fuel. There don't seem to be many international standards that apply, although in Europe, for the inter-European trade, they do have some standards and they do have some, if you like, some limits that apply to contents of material in them, such as fluoride and mercury, mainly because it could damage the cement kiln. It's not so much about whether it represents hazardous waste for human health. So I think the clear thing would be to have agreement at the Basel Convention with all parties taking part, negotiated transparently to establish exactly what this material is and how it should be handled. That would be the best solution.
Okay, another challenge we are having.
Speak louder, sir.
Okay, another challenge we also face. Some private sector operators in the country come to us and tell us that they are being offered some sort of incentive by developed countries. They want to establish facilities, to produce RDF in the country, in our own country. And of course, the condition is that we will allow waste, to come into the country to be handled by the facilities they are going to establish. They will fund everything, and we're saying no. Do that in your country. You have the capacity. We are grappling even with the waste that we generate locally. We have not been able to deal with that, and so we don't want to get involved, with waste that are coming from outside the country. And also, I wonder at times, why is it difficult for the developed countries or countries that where this RDF is being produced? Why is it difficult for them to use the RDF in their countries? Don't they have like at least the plants, cement plants and so on, to use those RDF in their countries instead of pushing those RDF to developing countries? And I agree with Jim. I think we should look at the possibility of addressing this issue under the auspices of the Basel Convention and ban it totally.
Yes. If you want to.
Yeah, thank you for your insight, sir. Yu, who's still with us, fortunately, would like to also share an insight on your questions.
Yes, thank you so much. It's an interesting topic to discuss, and I think it should be, first of all, it has to be clarified under Basel. What are the HS code considered for PEF and RDF? Because at the moment, as Marcus already mentioned, and also Lee, and based on our observation also, there are a lot of HS codes as an entry point for waste as RDF. But I think, Jim, we will be relying on you to push for this issue to be clarified at the Basel Convention. So it will be, so parties especially will have a clear idea which HS codes actually is supposed to be prohibited. In Indonesia at the moment, there is no prohibitions to import 3825, although our law, the Indonesian law already prohibited the importations of waste. In regards with plastics and paper, the importations, then the category and the name of HS 3915 and 4707 for paper scraps has been, the regulation has been titled importing waste as raw material for industrial processes. So that's how they can enter into the country. However, the RDF policy in every country should be really, really restricted, and if possible, no regulatory support for RDF, because you will open the Pandora box, because once you introduce the RDF idea as an alternative fuel in developing countries, it will create another hell, because we don't have, most developing countries do not have the capacity for the laboratory to monitor the POPs and new POPs, and cannot anticipate the waste entering into the country in the form of mixed waste. So I would like to praise the government of Kenya for saying no, and I hope you remain saying no for that, and I hope also other countries, because there are a lot of
Nigeria.
Oh, sorry, Nigeria. Thank you. And also for exporters, Jim mentioned this, I guess, in his presentations, that the declaration, and also my guess, the declaration of the bill of lading when they send the shipment to a particular country it could be manipulated or it could be misdeclared, and we will only find out what's in it, what's inside the containers after we open it, So there will be no mechanism to find out what's inside the containers unless the shipment was written by, an honest officer of the shipping agency. So it's everybody play their part to disguise this shipment. So I think it has to be stricter and strengthened. The check at the port and also the shipping company, and then at the ports also the customs have to be strengthened. But first and foremost is the government regulations. Please do not allow them to enter your country. Thank you.
Thank you, Yuri, and thank you, sir. So we'll entertain one question from our online participants from Fernando Bejarano to all our panelists. Hey, Fernando, we miss you here. So what are the consequences, actually for Jim, what are the consequences of the USA as non-party of the Basel Convention and is a big exporter of plastic waste? What are the challenges for the countries that are receiving the waste and that are parties?
Sure. So the other ban that's been in the convention since the beginning is it's forbidden for parties to trade with non-parties. There's one exception to that. If you establish an Article 11 agreement in a bilateral or multilateral way, then you can bring in non-parties. But that agreement has to be the environmental equivalent of Basel. It can't be weaker. So there is an equivalent agreement, at least people that are using it purport it to be, and that's the OECD agreement. So sometimes the U.S. can trade in plastics, for example, normally they would with other OECD countries. But in the case of the U.S., after these plastic amendments were adopted, they objected to them, and they went to the OECD and said, we don't like these new amendments. And so the ironic thing is the OECD said, okay, we're not going to allow them to be traded in the OECD regime, so the U.S. was locked out of it, and Basel still applies. So right now, with the U.S., they're not allowed to trade in this new dirty and mixed plastic white 48 with anybody except Canada. They've created an agreement with Canada. So I know Fernando's in Mexico right now. We're having a discussion because we just looked into the exports of the USA to Mexico, and they should not be happening at all if it's Y48 or one of the listings of plastic is going to be Y48 is PVC. And PVC does have an HS code, so we've identified PVC shipments going to Mexico. Totally illegal. And Mexico, right now, is allowing them to come in. And so, this is a big problem. So I've written to the government of Mexico to try to get their explanation before hammering them here at the meeting. I've been waiting for a letter from them for several days that they were going to send before the meeting ended. Hopefully before it started. But I think they're having trouble answering the question because I think we clearly caught them importing illegally. This is not a one-off case. The U.S. is moving Y48 and PVC all over the world. In fact, if you come Monday, gentleman from Nigeria, we're going to be having another talk Monday night, and we'll show the evidence of PVC being exported to your country. The actual bills of lading printouts. So you really got to watch the situation of the U.S. and why you do is because their exporters have no liability. They're not a party, so the U.S. is not going to punish them. They're not, anything liable for them to export. It's free trade out of the U.S. So this is a real problem. So we have the most wasteful country on the planet, not part of this treaty. And so we really have to uphold our end of it in the receiving countries and just say no.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yes.
Yes, thank you. Just to add on what Jim had just said, we notice in Africa that most of the countries that are targeted for maybe export or import of hazardous waste are the countries that are not party to the Bamako Convention. Because even e-waste is targeting Nigeria and maybe Ghana too. If you look at the map, these countries are not party to the Bamako Convention. So I think one way will be maybe for those countries to become party to the Bamako Convention. So
Yeah.
just to know the title here.
So Nigeria?
Yeah.
Yes. Because even this trader, they know. Because you see how this helped Tunisia to solve they bring out the Bamako Convention, they are party to the Bamako Convention. So it's one of the key issues.
Yeah, President, let me just say something. Although, yes, we need to ratify, we don't actually, in the case of e-waste, even plastic waste, we don't allow such to come into the country. And if there's any imports into the country, what it means is that it is illegal. And we know that there have been cases where even the customs, they have intercepted such shipments into the country. But for us, because we operate a permitting system, we don't issue licensing for import of plastic or e-waste to the country.
Thank you. We have time for maybe just two more questions. We'll take one from our online audience. Sorry, this one first. Sorry. From Elham, how can we prevent our countries from the illegal traffic and trade without POPs laboratories to identify the contents of POPs in the waste? Yeah.
You know, everybody's now heard of the national sword China put in place, that policy. But what is right under everyone's nose is that there was a reason they did what they did. It was a self-serving reason. They did the calculus after being the world's most dominant importer of waste for so many years, and they were extracting value from the waste. But they did the calculus and they realized that there was more liabilities and negative impacts than there was value. They did the ecological economic assessment and realized this is not paying off. The long-term costs for our country, the loss of our groundwater, our population's getting sick, we don't need this anymore. They actually didn't do it just to be nice. So this applies to every country. And people are forgetting that. They're just looking at the results of the chaos when they made that decision. But it was a very calculated decision, and it applies to every country. These things are costing your country much more than you benefit from it. So really think about that. What China did, that's the lesson there. So to answer your question, don't worry about laboratory analysis. Say no solid waste, no hazardous waste can come into the country. Saves you a lot of money on laboratory analysis.
Prevention is better than cure. So if you can block the imports that you suspect are highly likely to contain these materials, and these days you have things like PFAS products in food wrappers and brominated flame retardants in household goods, furnishing. Half of the textiles now are made of plastics that contain PFAS treatments. We know it's all there. We know it's going into household waste. When you shred it into small particles, it's very difficult to tell it apart until you use sophisticated analytical equipment. So the precautionary principle dictates that you stop this material before it reaches your border. And that's essentially what we're saying. the Basel Convention needs to make very clear in the technical guidelines and in the annexes that relate to this, but governments shouldn't wait necessarily for the outcomes of the Basel Convention processes. They can act unilaterally and protect their own borders. And China has.
Thank you. And so that question came from Elham Refat, Stockholm Convention focal point for Egypt. So thank you for your questions. And maybe one final question before the closing remarks from our speakers.
Okay, thank you for giving me the floor. I'm Hamajoda, focal point Basel Convention for Cameroon. Yeah, for us, the main challenge we are facing is the illegal trade. Because even a part of Bamako Convention, our regulation have already banned the importation of any waste. But how can we control all importations of EDF? That's our main challenge we are facing. Because somebody can declare wrong information on the waste they are importing.
Well, when it comes to enforcement, the first thing you got to be sure your country has done is not just ratify the convention, but put it into the national law. And when you do that, you have the legal ability to really prosecute.
No, we ratified.
Yeah, I know, ratification is step one, but put it into your national law so that your prosecutors can actually do something with it. Now, technically, ratifying should be enough, but when it comes down to a legal battle, if you don't have it in your national law, it's going to be really tough. So I don't know if Cameroon does or not. But the other thing to remember that Basel is really good in that it says illegal traffic is a criminal act. So when it's a criminal act, you put people in jail. And if you really start to punish people, this thing will dry up really quickly. We had a situation in the US where a lot of electronic waste was flying off the shore, right? And our GPS trackers caught out a recycler, and those two executives for that company had to go to jail for 28 months each. And this is in a country that doesn't even have the Basel Convention to back it up. It was based on fraud. So fraud law is there for you. But when you're a Basel party, make this a criminal act and have the punishments actually mean that they're getting criminally punished. So not just a slap on the wrist or a fine, people having to do real jail time. And I wish I could say that the US, my country, that these people should be liable. We're working on that for a long time, using fraud law or trying to get the US to ratify the convention. But it really does make a difference to prosecute the crimes.
So, yes, thank you for your questions. May I now request our speakers for a brief closing message that you want to leave to our audience.
I might just start with that. And my first comment would be that we need to talk to the Australian government, the new government in Australia, and move away from these cynical export models of waste recycling and waste movement. And we need to deal with our own waste at home. Because if you don't start dealing with your own waste domestically, you don't develop the means to do it. It's politically lazy to allow exports of materials to other countries who aren't in a position to deal with it properly. We're a developed country, we have the material resources, we have the financial resources and the technical capacity to deal with the waste ourselves, and we should do that. And so I think that all countries need to look into what they can do themselves for their own waste streams and avoid dumping waste on other countries as a short-term, politically lazy measure. So the precautionary principle will protect countries who want to implement border controls and prevent these wastes coming in to some extent, but as you mentioned, there will always be some forms of illegal trade, and sometimes you need to carry a big stick in relation to these issues, and I would encourage countries to do so.
Thank you. Yu, your brief closing message, please.
Yes, My message is that to remind all of us, and especially delegates, government officials, that RDF is only a different form of pollutions, but it's even worse because it's converted the visible waste into the invisible one, because you can't see the pollution and it's up to the air, and it's even worse. It will be inhaled by people 24 hours. So RDF should not be considered as best environmental practices, and following the precautionary principle is best, and improve your waste management system. That's the best. And also, please prohibit the importation of RDF or municipal waste in various codes, 3825, 360, 690, 391590. So everything with 90 at the back is going to be a mix of everything. So good luck and stay strong. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I concur with Lee and Yu, but also want to caution you. RDF is also coming in through paper imports, paper-based imports. Yeah, because there is residual waste in the paper-based imports, like plastic waste, and we can see from the paper mills in Malaysia itself, they have already started on-site incinerators to, because of the residual waste, they will turn it into RDFs and co-firing in the incinerators. So the thing is, we need to reduce the waste that we are generating. Yeah? So that's my final message.
Thank you, Marcus. Jim?
So yeah, I've had a few points to make already, but I'll just go back to plastics. Because why this is happening is we've been producing way too many plastics. And as we begin to expose the problems with plastics and how they're inherently not circular, the recycling part of it is getting more and more pressure. So if you put your mind into the industry and was realizing they want to triple the amount of plastic they want to produce in the next 10 years, their only way out, because it's going to be shown more and more that recycling is bankrupt if this doesn't work. We've only recycled 9%, and that's even inflated for all this time in history. Their only way out is to say that burning is the green thing to do. And it's not. So any scheme that's going to burn plastics or any kind of waste, in my view, has got to be looked at with great skepticism. And this is their Achilles heel, is they don't have an end-of-life strategy except for burning it. And this is why we have RDF, so be aware.
Thank you, our dear speakers. Let's give them again a round of applause. So the video of this side event will be available in the IPEN website, also the DRS website, and in the Geneva Environment Network website, which will also include the slides. So watch out for that. So thank you all once again for coming, and thank you for your kind attention, and take care on your way home later tonight, and have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, sorry, we have here other side events scheduled for the next few days and even next week. Please watch out for them and do attend them. Thank you.